Hey friends, welcome to the Determinetruth Podcast, where we equip the church to be the church. Well, hey everyone, welcome in. This is week 4 of video podcast. So still hello to new subscribers we have on YouTube and to old subscribers who are watching us for the first time, and you're getting used to having to see us. The nausea is hopefully wearing off. Maybe take some Dramamine before you watch the show. But we are wrapping up our series on 2 Thessalonians, and we always try to bring in a guest scholar when we finish a book of the Bible. And so, Rob, who's our guest today?
We actually found one this time.
First time, once in a row.
Yeah, we're really excited. So Dr. Gene Green is a professor emeritus of New Testament at Wheaton College and graduate school. Gene previously worked as a missionary in Latin America, teaching New Testament in the Dominican Republic, serving as professor of New Testament and rector of the Seminario ESEPA. That's what I'm going to go with, Gene.
Let's try it. Seminario ESEPA.
Okay, there you go. In Costa Rica. His writings include commentaries on the letters to the Thessalonians and Jude and 2 Peter, and many others as well. The primary focus of his research has been the intersection of the gospel and cultures, both ancient and contemporary. Gene and his wife, Deborah, have 2 accomplished daughters and 3 vigorous grandchildren. I like that word, Gene. And they're members of the Gary United Methodist Church in Wheaton, Illinois. Gene, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, it's great to be here, and I'm excited to jump in with you all on this study of Thessalonians. The first time I heard a serious study of 1 Thessalonians was in the Dominican Republic many years ago when my wife and I were serving as missionaries there, and Dr. John Stott came and did a fabulous exposition of 1 Thessalonians. And then after that, I began to teach on Thessalonians, and unfortunately or fortunately, I taught about 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 in a way that wasn't pleasing to some people about the rapture of the church.
Been there.
And let's just say we left the Dominican Republic after that time.
Bummer for them. They got to deal with it now.
But out of it, I wrote this then, the first work, and I'm sure that both of you have read this, Primera y Segunda Thessalonicenses,
backwards,
by Eugenio Green. So that was my first publication on Thessalonians.
Very good.
But you do have a commentary that is accessible to our English-speaking friends through the Pillar Commentary series.
Yes, if they haven't learned to speak in tongues in Spanish, yes. And in fact, I'm not sure the Spanish one is still in print, but the Pillar New Testament Commentary, D.A. Don Carson asked me to write on Thessalonians in there. So it was
just great work. It's a great work.
Absolute joy to do it.
And that whole series is just fantastic. So it's cool that you got to be able to contribute to
I was quite honored to do that.
Yeah, great. Well, hey, as we start off, we always try to do overviews. And so we did that, number of weeks ago, but we'd love to hear your perspective on just addressing what's happening in Thessalonica when Paul wrote these letters. What do you see as the central issues behind 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? So if you were to give just a few minute kind of bird's eye overview, how would you start a conversation or a teaching on this topic?
Well, I think the place to start is not in the book itself, but rather over in the book of Acts. I'm not skeptical about the historical reliability of Acts. I think Luke is giving a faithful account of what was happening on Paul's journeys, and the one that we know as the second missionary journey after he was in Philippi along with Silas and Timothy. They toddled on down the Ignatian Way from Philippi to Amphipolis and Apollonia, and then reached Thessalonica, and where there was a synagogue of the Jews. So in Acts chapter 17 is a place where I think we have to begin and seeing how that the gospel came to the Jew first, as Paul was always doing, and then to the Greeks. And if you read Acts, you don't see the Gentiles as much, except as a force opposed to Paul. But when you read 1 Thessalonians in chapter 1, we have an account of the conversion of the Thessalonians, how they turned to God from idols to serve the living and the true God. So these, I believe that the bulk of the congregation were Gentiles, and who were then converted out of idolatry. So what we have here is one of the first, if not the first, letters of the Apostle Paul, depending on how you date Galatians. So it's a very, very early letter, and written not long after the church was founded because of the persecution in town. Paul had to skip town, but he sent Timothy and Silas back to find out how the church was doing. So Paul was with them a very short time, and we don't know exactly how long, maybe a couple of months, but he had to leave early. So he left a congregation that was first being persecuted for their faith. Secondly, they were bereft of their leadership. The founders of the church, they haven't received all the Christian instruction that they needed. In fact, Paul wants to get back to, as he says, supply what is lacking in your faith. And, he was concerned. He felt like he was orphaned from them, separated from them. And the pathos in this letter in chapters 2 and 3 is really profound, that you see him as a nursing mother, you see him as a father with his children, you see him as somebody who has tremendous integrity. And they were wondering, I think they were wondering what happened. Here's this guy who comes along as an itinerant preacher and then leaves and doesn't come back. So he says, I tried to get back, I couldn't get back. And so at last he sent his emissaries, Silas and Timothy, up there. And then when he is in Corinth, they then return. And in chapter 3, they tell him about the good news that they continued in faith and love and endurance. Faith, hope, and love were the markers of the community. But still, there was a lot that was, left unsaid, untaught. And so Timothy comes back with questions, Timothy and Silas do, and also it appears that they might have sent him a letter similar to what the Corinthians did with Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And he's responding to a lot of that. So congregation, young in the faith, persecuted, without leadership. So much of this letter is just laying out some foundations.
Okay. Now, do you see that some of these Gentiles might have been God-fearers, meaning people that were actually in the synagogue? The reason why I'm asking this question is when you have an infantile church that's under persecution and the leader of it leaves before Paul, before he wants to, and the intense persecution, what's the source of leadership? Who's leading this congregation, and what's the focal point of the message? It seems obviously they got heavily involved in some kind of eschatological, apocalyptic type of thinking that the suffering may have continued or exacerbated. So what do you see as the situation of that early primitive church in terms of leadership structure, and what are the teachings that are going on there?
Well, we do know from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that there was some false teaching that came in about the day of the Lord. Paul really didn't know how that teaching came in, whether it was by somebody's preaching, a prophecy, or a pseudepigraphical letter, a letter as if from us. But he knew that some false teaching had come in. So the question of leadership, I think, is always one that, as you read the book of Acts, Paul and his associates are always trying to address.
Right.
And he addresses it by appointing elders, not always immediately after the founding of the church. He'll send emissaries there. And then obviously the letters themselves. I think it was, was it Seneca who talked about receiving a letter, and he says, I feel like I'm in your company immediately when I see, the impress of a friend's hands upon the page. So the letters themselves have, I would like to call them sacramental. There's a real presence in these letters that brings the apostle right before the church. Now, whether or not they were able to establish leaders among them, is a question. And over in chapter 5, isn't it, where he begins to talk about the leadership in the church. So I think that this is what he always does. And the apostle never wants to leave these new believers on their own. And there's this tension that's there between needing to, keep going and spread the gospel, and then the care of the churches. And that's there throughout the New Testament.
Okay. Now, these letters speak a lot about persecution and suffering. It's almost like maybe some of the best expositions on persecution and suffering of the New Testament letters. What do you think that Paul's understanding of suffering in the Christian life was? I mean, how do we understand this today in terms of what he was saying? And then how might that speak to us today, especially the global church and the West, especially in the West when we, quote, don't experience suffering?
Well, a lot of people say that we do, but sometimes this is because of our own foolishness that we experience.
I always say being a jerk doesn't count as suffering. Suffering because you're a jerk doesn't qualify.
I think that, I've read that text too.
Yeah.
The first book of Rob, and I think that's it. It was interesting that the early Christian catechism included a theology of suffering. Okay, we think about the way that we instruct people who are young in the faith, or even people that are a little bit older and moldier in the faith, but we often, especially here in America, leave out the issue of suffering. But he front ends it. In fact, over in chapter 3 of 1 Thessalonians, he says, don't you remember while I was with you, I was telling you these things, and he instructed them in about suffering, as 1 Peter also has a very, very keen sense, really, throughout the whole New Testament. So it was right there. And if now, I think you're right. There are probably some God-fearers in there. We find out about them. Gentiles who were in the synagogue in Acts chapter 17. But the majority, I think, came out of idolatry, out of the many religions that were current in the city of Thessaloniki. Now, the thing in that time was that if you wanted to add another god to your pantheon, that was no big deal. Bring it on. The gods many, lords many. And I think about one of the temples downtown Corinth that was dedicated to all the gods, because, you don't want to leave anyone out. And your job is to maintain the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, which meant that you always would follow the religion of your father, the pater familias, would set the religious direction, and then also within your community. So to break with religion in this era where religion was cut part of the fabric of society is seen as an antisocial act. You are not maintaining the Pax Deorum. And so that
anti-imperial too, isn't it, in a sense, because you're undermining the empire?
Well, especially there in Thessaloniki, because they did have an imperial temple in the town dedicated to Julius Caesar. and the son of God, Augustus, who was Julius's adopted son. So it was kicking against the imperial claims, and as we know, that resistance to the power of empire is shot through the New Testament. And I think it's one of the most important things for today. Now, Christians in the majority world obviously have faced opposition, the likes of which many of us have not experienced. I remember Giancarlo Pallavicini, a student of mine in Costa Rica, who went to Jordan and then to Egypt as a missionary. And he suffered, and his children suffered.
Wow.
His children were stoned on the way to school because of their faith. And people couldn't understand why he looked Arab, but he wasn't a Muslim. And so a lot of hostility. And I'll never forget Janka, as we used to call him. Janka came back to Costa Rica. He said, "Why didn't you tell me about this? Why didn't you tell me that we were going to suffer for our faith?" And I'd have to say to him, well, Giancarlo, you weren't in my class on First Peter. But it is that theology of suffering, not for our own sins, but because we're marching in a way that is contradictory to the values in society. An old friend of mine, Neil, worked in the Caterpillar factory when I was in Springfield, Illinois. And he decided to give an honest day's work for a day's pay. And he got all kinds of flack from his fellow workers because they wanted to slow it all down. There was too much pressure on them. So it's even in places where I think here in America, where integrity in our work, that truthfulness, the honesty, can put a true believer in conflict with the powers that be, whether they be the boss or fellow workers. So persecution can come in a lot of different ways. I think about the women.
That's a really interesting point that I don't think I've ever thought of until now, because we oftentimes think of persecution as being something happening in a Christian sense because you're being vocal about your faith. So whether it's in an apologetic type arena or evangelistic arena, but you're saying by just living a Christian ethic, that could open you up to persecution, not because you're actually naming the name of Jesus, but you're just living in a Jesus ethic, and that's causing persecution. I don't think I've ever thought of it that way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, that's the essence of the gospel, right? This alternative lifestyle, right? Of loving your neighbor and loving your enemy, and that's a threat to those in power. It's a threat to the corporation. It's a threat to other religions. It's a threat to the government. It's like, no, we're fundamentally living distinctly and Christianly, and I think that's the essence of the gospel. What are your thoughts?
And we're watching this right now, We're thinking, I think Matthew 25 is where we all need to return. And the question is, how do I be a neighbor? And what am I called to, and what are we called to as a people, with respect to the poor, with respect to those who are ill, with respect to the foreigner?
The immigrant, right?
The immigrant. And so what happens when we have Christians who say, I'm going to help immigrants. I'm going to speak on their behalf. I'm going to seek their welfare. And then the type of opposition that can come, I think about here near Chicago. Recently, we saw the image of a priest praying outside of ICE detention center. And he got shot with a pepper ball in the head by ICE agents for simply praying for those in real need. These are not evil criminals. These are people that came to the United States fleeing themselves, sometimes persecution, fleeing gangs, fleeing deep poverty, fleeing repressive government agents. and they found their way here and couldn't find a legal way, but they found their way in. And whether they should be here or not, I think we need revision of our immigration laws and access, but to just unleash hell on them is not
to
the way
treat
to
them
go about
inhumanely.
it.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah. We're called to love our neighbors ourselves.
We've done some series on immigration, Gene, on our YouTube channel as well. And one of the things that strikes me, Gene, and see what your thoughts are here before we move on to the next question, that is so much of the opposition when you speak up on immigration comes from the church.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. And I think this is the distressing thing.
Yeah.
I've asked very often, what's our catechism today? Who's teaching the people of God? What are they listening to? Or get maybe a sermonette for Christianettes on a Sunday morning, and that's about the depth of the biblical understanding and exposition that people get, and they need a broader, deeper understanding through their own study, through teaching in the church, and through you guys and what you're doing here. I think it's an essential ministry to help people grow in faith, to grow up and deepen in their faith. And we've got so many countervailing winds right now that are turning us away from the nature of the gospel. And here in Thessalonians, I'm reading chapter 2 of 2 Thessalonians, and that was religious power that went wrong, and religion and politics were like this. That at that time, the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor as a way to maintain order within the Roman Empire was a key issue. And I'm very concerned these days about the way that we are merging in an unholy way the gospel with nationalism. And we talked about Christian nationalism. I know you guys will probably take that up at some time if you haven't done so already.
Yeah, we have already. Yeah, good. All right.
Yeah. Hey, I'm curious, just as we wrap up this kind of conversation, Gene, your thoughts on something. We have a wide variety of listeners or viewers, and so some people might be very comfortable with what you just said, and especially how you addressed the issue of how Christians ought to engage immigration and immigrants and that sort of thing. And I think you were speaking more from a Christian ethics standpoint, not necessarily a political standpoint, although we have our bubbles on how we read things, and so people are going to want to hear what they want to hear. My question to you would be, how would you pastor or shepherd someone in this conversation, a Christian who might be hearing what you're saying and is immediately jumping to the political side of things, and they might be more on the right side of things, where there are 4 strong immigration policies, there are 4 strong borders, and they say, no, there's something that needs to be done here. But they're immediately seeing that filter that they've been trained to see through, which is a political first and then Jesus. How would you encourage those folks through the lens of a Jesus ethic to say, but regardless of what you think about how policy should be played out, this is our first call. And just what's a way to challenge them that maybe could, not saying you were doing this, but that we could strip it of its political nature and just say, regardless of where we're at politically, this should be our common ground and our shared values in terms of how we love people. I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
Well, that's I intimated that when I talked about Matthew 25 and our call to love one another, and the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And thank you for the question, Vinnie, because this is one that I'm working over personally at the moment at our church. We're doing a series right now on Christian nationalism, 4-week series, and we started this last Sunday. And I started out, we just talked a little bit about definitions, but then went right back to the gospel. And went right back to Scripture and what was happening in Jesus's day, and how he dealt with the powers that be, and with the desire of the disciples to restore the kingdom to Israel at this time. It was religious nationalism at that point. So I think we go back and we bring out the book, and we sit down and love with one another, and we agree to disagree, and we speak to one another out of love and respect. And I do think that there's a lot of listening that has to happen, that we listen to one another, and that we understand each other in deep ways, and we don't try to make another person's position just a caricature. We let each person speak, and that's what the atmosphere I'm trying to create in our adult education class at the church. And there are people that are tense, and people that are happy. And but I think that there's the joy in dialogue. There's a joy in discussion. And as long as we keep the gospel centered, and then we have the hard questions, as you said, Vinnie, of Christian ethics, and then how then do we think about contemporary situations? But we have to get down on that road. We have to let it land on the road. As John Mackay said, we can do theology from the balcony, way up here detached, or we can do it from the road where life is lived tensely. And that's where we are right now. How do we do our biblical reflection and theology on the road where people live? I think it's one of the greatest challenges pastorally, and my heart goes out to every pastor in America right at this time, trying to keep the saints together.
And even there, it's difficult because you have to undisciple folks because we've been discipled as a society in the West to be polarized, to everything be which side are you on? If you're not for it, you're against it. And that's the most difficult thing, is starting with deconstructing people. It's funny how that's such a bad word. It's a naughty word in so many circles. But even in the most conservative circles, which is, that's where I tend to be theologically, I live in that world. And it's like, don't you realize you need to deconstruct from the way society has told you how you ought to believe about politics and political worldviews and who you side with, and they're the enemy. And it's funny because the word enemy even has come up so much in the latest political realm in terms of that's how we describe people. They are the enemy. They're and there's this great line in the West Wing. I'm a huge West Wing fan. And at one point, one of the staffers was saying, they're not the enemy, they're the opposition. And it's funny, I've been rewatching through the West Wing this past year just to get some sort of goodness of what politics could be. And it's that line has hit me so hard because we've been trained to view everyone as the enemy if they think differently. It's like, no, they're the opposition. It's a vastly different concept because your enemy you fight against and you want to defeat and you want them to be destroyed. But that's not the case with the opposition. The football team you play on Sunday is the opposition, even when it's the Raiders and the Patriots. The Patriots can be the opposition. They don't have to be the enemy, even though they're evil. But at the end of the day, you could still have dinner with the person after.
It was an incomplete pass, Vinnie.
It was a fumble, Rob.
Yeah. Anyway. I guess I was my wife and I spent 6 years in the UK and in Scotland and in England, and I always enjoyed the discussions and the debates held, at least in the communities I was with in places like Tyndale House in Cambridge, England. And you disagree, and then you go out to the pub and have a pint. Or maybe you go to a potluck after or whatever, if the pint isn't your thing. But I do think that keeping the unity of the faith in the bond of love, we are called to love our neighbor as ourselves. And we're also called, the love command is switched up at times, to love our brother and sister. And that dominance of love within the community. And in fact, this is one of the issues that Paul has to deal with in the Thessalonian congregation. Timothy comes back, from the church. Silas and Timothy do, and they bring back some questions. And I don't know, you probably recall 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 9. Now concerning love of the brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anyone write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. And indeed, you do love all the brothers and sisters throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more, so that, as we say in Spanish, más y más, more and more, just keep building up. And I think it's interesting that Paul starts with, you're taught of God to love one another. You know, is he thinking about how the Spirit teaches us? Okay. Are we taught of God by the command to love? Are we taught by love by the example of Christ? And I think it's multiplex, that people we have this example of love. I don't know. Anybody know John 3:16? But that
I see it in the football games on signs all the
somewhere
time.
A sign out there. Yes, out in the bleachers. But we're taught of God to love one another, for God so loved the world. And this is where the imitatio Dei, the imitation of God, and the imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, comes in. As Christ does, so we do to one another. And that was a message for the Thessalonian church. And, you think about our struggles today. And maybe as I'm reading the New Testament, the early church had struggles too, didn't they?
Yeah,
the inclusion of Gentiles, the Gentile running dogs into the church, and then eating together with them. And Peter was called on the carpet for that. And what he had to do was come back and say, look, God is working in these Gentile believers. And the Jewish believers in Jerusalem threw up their hands. They say, God gave salvation to the Gentiles. Hallelujah. So it was good. So we go back, I think, to the basics, as the Thessalonians had to do, and with all these mixed communities. It wasn't just, the divisions in ethnicity. There were divisions, socioeconomic divisions. We see this in especially like 1 Corinthians. There were gender differences within the church. And how does this community get along, where you have Jews and Greeks and barbarians, and all together? You have slave and free sitting together at the same table.
Yeah.
So our struggles today to maintain the unity of the faith are, well, we've been here before.
Yeah.
And we've
done pretty well. There's only like 1,000 Baptist denominations. I don't think we've...
That's all.
At Determined Truth, we do more than just this podcast. One of our major projects is training pastors in India each week. We even help start a Bible college there. But we could only do this because of the generous support from partners like you. Seriously, that means you. If you consider supporting us with a fully tax-deductible donation with anything from $5 a month or more, we can continue to equip the church to be the church. To give, go to determinetruth.com and click on the Give tab, or find the link in today's show notes. Thanks.
So, hey, let me change the conversation a little bit, Gene.
Sure.
You alluded to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and the man of lawlessness whole passage, and some letter, support, or vision or prophecy that came into the church, and Paul doesn't even know where it came from. They clearly had some kind of eschatological understanding of things. If you can maybe set the table for us, what you think Paul might have been saying in light of their suffering and persecution and the eschaton. And then what is this man of lawlessness thing? Vinnie and I tried to address it. I read your commentary and I still don't know what it's about. Yeah. And I've written books on eschatology, right? So help us understand, kind of walk through that a little bit.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think that Charles Giblin, in his book on 2 Thessalonians 2, gives us a fresh insight
Okay.
into what's going on there. When Paul talks about this figure, this man of lawlessness, who sets himself up in the temple, showing himself that he is God. He resists everything that is worshipped and that is divine. And he takes on this position in the temple of God himself. I've had to ask, what was going on in the Thessalonians' mind?
Right.
Especially since the majority of them, the vast majority, are not Jews.
Right.
We're always reading that text with reference to the temple in Jerusalem.
Right.
And the theology that comes out of that, we're waiting for the rebuilding of the temple before Jesus returns and all that. And I think, no, I don't think that's right. Yeah. What Paul and the Thessalonians knew was the imperial cult.
Okay.
Where you had the worship of the emperor as a god, complete with prayers and sacrifices to the emperor as divine, as the divine benefactor. And it was, let's say, if the emperor is the benefactor of your city, and I think you have to remember that Thessalonica was a very Macedonian city, but it was also one that was very faithful to the Romans. They honored the Romans, and there's a long history behind that. But I've got a book here that has no title page. Well, it's got a title page, but nothing on the cover, by Holland Hendricks. This was his PhD dissertation out of Harvard. And you probably can't read that. Thessalonians honor Romans, and it's all about, or Thessalonica honors Romans. It's all about the imperial cult in the city. So this was rocking and rolling in town. And of anything in the history of Thessaloniki, they were loyal to Rome and the emperor. And because of that, floods of money came into the city. You had mixed Greek and Latin inscriptions in the town. So the imperial cult is rocking and rolling. So when they're talking about somebody setting themselves up in the temple, they're probably thinking more in terms of imperial cult. And this power, this man of lawlessness, that is the embodiment of the fusion of power, of religion and political power. And even, he talks about that lawlessness, the mystery of lawlessness, which is already at work.
Yep, right.
And a lot of people will say, well, there's a restrainer, the katechon, which is somebody that is something resisting the revealing of the man of lawlessness. And I think Giblin, however, is right that this language of katechon in the Greek was also used to talk about demonic possession being seized by some supernatural power. So I think what you've got here in 2 Thessalonians 2 is, first off, the imperial cult in the background. You've got the anticipation the man of lawlessness is going to take all power, all control, but the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. And then you have the katechon, which is not taken out of the way, but goes out of the way. It's not passive voice, it's a middle voice, it's active, he goes out of the midst. It's sort of like you have the prelude and then the full manifestation. Very similar to 1 John. He talks about the coming of the Antichrist, but there's already a lot of Antichrist in the world. And I think that Paul is using different language, but running down the same road. That lawlessness, that power is already here, but we're waiting for they were waiting for that full manifestation of the exaltation of the emperor in the imperial cult. That leaves us with questions about what this has to do with us today, and how we think about it. And again, the fusion of religion and political power, religious nationalism. I mean, you find it within the Hindu community. It's not just Christian community, but there's this unholy alliance between power and faith. And that's I think the main thing that we need to look at in relationship to 2 Thessalonians 2.
Do you see that, just connecting that, leaping forward to this end times eschatological, almost dispensational thinking, that Paul's referring to something that's going to manifest itself in some futuristic way as popular imagined, or what does that look like today? I think you've alluded to that, but let me see if
I think that we are already, we watch, as John says, the Antichrist. That these things, 1 John, the mystery of lawlessness, the Antichrist, small a, are already with us. But there will be a time, and I think we all have to be aware of what is happening right now. Now, how this is all going to play out in the future, in a world where we don't have, as a commonplace, the imperial cult with imperial temples in city after city. We don't have that, but what we do have are these strong religious institutions that then get merged with faith in ways that are truly unrighteous, unholy, and even wicked. And that's something that I think that is true of every age, and not just their age and our age. So, I remember having, I had a tape from Chuck Smith out of Calvary Chapel in California. He said, the rapture of the church won't happen any later than 1979. Okay. So I'm very cautious about that type of date setting and saying it's going to be exactly this. But there are these common themes of power and religion that I think 2 Thessalonians 2 alerts us to.
Yeah. Chuck Smith's been misunderstood about. He meant 2079, just for the record.
Oh, that's right. That's it.
Okay.
I knew it.
We still got time. So let me deviate down this path just a little bit for just a second. I know we're going off the script a little bit, Vinnie, and we'll just kind of cut some things out here as we're finishing up here pretty soon. But don't you see that because the imperial religion, the imperial cult isn't so clearly evident like it was in the Roman world, that it's maybe even more insidious because the politics and the political cult and the ideology of the emperor has creeped into the church so much so that we've just, it's part of the fabric of who we are. And I think that's even more dangerous than when it was apparent for Paul and maybe John in the book of Revelation. Hey guys, this is emperor worship. This is wrong. I think we're in a more dangerous path in American climate is what I'm speaking of.
I think you're right. I mean, and you've been doing a lot of thinking on this one, and you're right. And the question that we then have, how do we sound the alarm on it? And again, it's not just here in the United States, but globally.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
What are the lessons that we should have learned from Constantine? And we think about Constantine as the good Christian, but let me tell you, he merged political power with faith, but then also with the imperial cult. He was not exempt to that, and that over exaltation of a leader as divine, and if doing no wrong, or if he does wrong, that we don't care because he's been anointed by God, chosen by God. So this type of thing that we're looking at here, and what you're mentioning is something that I think is very much part of the global story, not just our national story right now.
Yeah, I think we might have like a 2-hour conversation offline on this one because I think we're going on the same. I'm sorry, I'm deviating a little bit more, Vinnie, but we've assimilated so much of the faith into this political, cultural, religio climate, socioeconomic climate, that it's almost impossible to detach it. And the way I think, obviously my work in the book of Revelation, but let me think what you think about this in terms of Thessalonica and the letters of the New Testament. that John in Revelation was like, hey guys, Jezebel is a false prophetess. I mean, yet Jezebel was in the church. And so she was accepted by the community as a true prophetess. And you wonder, what did they do when when the church in Thyatira got this letter from John, or the message from John, like, hey, he's saying she's a false prophetess, or 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Diotrephes who loves to be first. You have these false teachers in the church, and we just naturally assume, well, the prophet won, obviously John won, Paul won, and the church, recanted and they repented. But yet I see it so deeply ingrained in our American culture today that when you try to be a prophetic voice, you're shunned. And I wonder, do you think some of that might have been true for Paul? Peter?
I mean, the very fact that there were voices getting into the Thessalonian church,
right,
and that were trying to screw up their eschatology, and Paul has to come in and give a corrective, I think is a lesson for us as well.
Yeah.
That what are the forces, what are the powers that are capturing people's minds and imagination and faith, and holding it captive, not to the gospel, but to an ideology that is antithetical to the gospel. So, what are the books that are relevant today? I remember we used to read and study the book of Revelation along with the book of Daniel as just predicting the end times.
Yeah, a template,
and that was it. We had our Dake Bible and our Larkin on Revelation, and of course everyone's second Bible was Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth.
Yeah.
We were apocalyptic.
Yeah.
But we never really learned that apocalyptic literature is not simply about the inbreaking in the future, but it's about what's happening right now.
The breaking that already has, very good.
Yeah, I mean, it's right now. It's right now. So, Rob, we need to go back to the book of Revelation. I think that should be part of our basic catechism these days. And that's why I think, talking about how we talk to folk, sometimes it's fun to lead people in the study of Scripture. And kind of wake them up to some of the discussions that we've been having in the Guild for many, many years. The Empire Studies and how we're very, very aware. Let's bring this right down. Into the church. I even think that 1 Peter 3:18 through 22, Christ went to preach to the spirits in prison. Right. They're like, well, how many books? 3-4 books written on this, and commentaries innumerable. But there's relevance there to see the power of Christ over all the powers that be. I mean, these texts are incredibly relevant for us if we just take the time to kind of work through them. And they're very disarming because people don't have the defenses ready to respond.
And that's the beauty of it. Yeah, we did the immigration series with that thinking. Well, Americans they're sensitive. Evangelicals are sensitive if you start talking about Muslims, or you start talking about the Middle East, you start talking about Russia. But if you talk about Latin America, they don't know a lot about it.
Yeah.
And so that becomes like, okay, let's talk about the empire and what we've done. And so that's kind of been our approach. So let me do a quick commercial, by the way, Vinnie. We did a video series that we're producing on our YouTube channel right now. We have 2 series going on. They're each about 15-minute long videos. Every week we release a new video. One's on Revelation Revealed, where we're just looking at key parts of Revelation to talk about what is John's message then and how does it apply today in terms of what was John trying to alert the church to, not the positive message of being the witnesses and the lampstands, but hey, this is what the empire is doing. And then we have another series on the book of Revelation itself that's just going chapter 1 through chapter 22. And each video is about 15 minutes long. So I want to encourage our viewers and listeners to get into that. Vinnie, you want to wrap this up with a few questions here before we finish up? Thanks so much for your time, Gene.
Yeah, and as I'm hearing you wrapping up, Gene, over the last few minutes, I wanted to ask you a question that kind of mirrors our opening question. So the opening question was, can you give an overview of the books of Thessalonians? And you gave a great background and overview. You went to the book of Acts and whatnot. If I were to ask you, can you give an overview of how the books of Thessalonians are relevant to the churches of the United States today, and even the global church, but especially the churches of the U.S., how would you give that teaching? And I'm assuming it's surmising what you've talked about a lot over the last 15 minutes or so. But if you were to give like an elevator pitch on this is how Thessalonians is relevant to the church specifically today, an application standpoint, how would you give that message?
Yeah, I think in First Thessalonians, Paul summarizes the nature of Christian mission and how the gospel came to Thessalonica. And I think it's a very, very important chapter because we see the gospel coming not in word only, but in the power of the Spirit, and how that true conversion that went on, and then how the gospel sounded out from them throughout Macedonia, the province of Macedonia, and to the south in Achaia. And Paul says, so that I don't have to say anything. In other words, he didn't have to even preach in certain places because the Thessalonians had been there. So I think there's some real basic story. There's a real basic story here about the nature of conversion and faith and witness in our world. I think chapter 1 is stellar that way. I think another place where you really have to go back and take a look at what Paul does in chapters 2 and 3, especially the beginning of chapter 2, where he talks about integrity, about virtue. Now, Abraham Malherbe, in his wonderful commentary, says that what Paul is doing there is putting himself up as an example of the type of integrity a leader should have. And I think that's part of it, but I think he's answering a question in there about that was being put to him about don't you really care about us? But whether you take that view or Malherbe, it's still the very fact that there is an example here for Christian leaders today. You know, he goes after the pride, he goes after the glory, he goes after the money, he goes after the care that he had for them. And so I think that's a second place where we really can gain a lot of benefit from this book. And remember also that one of Paul's concerns is to make sure that the church, this church and others, are stable in the faith. Take a look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, this whole issue of sending Timothy and Paul's concern about them because of their the adversity that they were facing. It's a book that helps us to go back and learn the basics. And how do we help people to learn the basics of the faith and ground them in the faith, so that they're not going to be moved, as Paul says over to the Ephesians, by every wind of doctrine. I think we take a look at the large bulk of this book in chapter 4 and 5 as just almost shotgun, taking issue after issue after issue after issue, as he understands them being a problem for the church. So it goes back to the fundamental didactic role that leadership has in the church to bring people along in the faith. Then we get to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is kind of a review of, about persecution and trying to frame persecution within the larger plan of God. And we talked about 2 Thessalonians 2. 2 Thessalonians 1 is about persecution. 2 Thessalonians 2 with that eschatological piece. But then you guys have already talked about 2 Thessalonians 3 and the issue of work, which I'll go along with Bruce Winter and his perspective on it, and seek the welfare of the city, that he's talking about the way that benefactors worked and patron-client relationships and all of that. And it's not just about, if you can't find a job, then tough luck, buddy. I'm not going to show any empathy towards you. I think we really have to be careful to read this within its original intent and read it within the whole arc of Scripture, and not just take out a text here and make that the universal for everything.
Yeah, we never do that.
No, never.
No,
never.
no.
Never.
They do, but yeah.
Nice. Hey, well, Gene, thanks for spending time with us. This has been just such a great conversation. I think it's fascinating too, if you're listening to this and you're listening to Gene, to your overview that you just gave. There's a sliver about, hey, this part might, be about eschatology, but the majority of it's not. There's so much strong Christian ethics and application for today. Yeah. And that's not normally how we think about these two books. This goes into the eschatology canon. This goes into, here's our favorite passages to proof text, how we could look at why the end of the world is going to be this kind of way and whatnot. And we just miss so much application.
We really do. And I think about the abuse that First Thessalonians has received in the passage on 4:13 through the end of the chapter. We use that about speculation about the rapture of the church, and really, it's about people who have died. And how do you not be overcome with grief? And I love the last line there in chapter 4. Therefore, comfort. I call it. I'd rather encourage than comfort. I think it's this letter of consolation in there. And how do we come around those people who are grieving? And how do we give them hope in the midst of a very hopeless world, especially in the face of death? So, a lot of pastoral stuff in here.
Well, we might have to have you back for our discussion on 1 Peter in a few months.
So there you go.
First Peter is just one of the classic texts that we overlook so often because we so focus on Paul, it seems like, on the church. But this has been just such a joy. It was a joy to meet you a few weeks back, and I look forward to continuing conversations with you.
Well, thank you. And thanks for inviting me. And again, all the best to you and all the ones who are watching and listening this and learning from these series that you're putting together. Very, very important as part of the catechism for the church. And yes, let's go back to Peter. I think Peter is, as Hengel said, the underestimated apostle. So there's a lot to say about our brother.
It's good stuff.
That's good. Hey, we'll link in the show notes to your commentary through Pillar Commentary on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. If you're going to do a study on those books, we highly encourage you picking up that resource. It's very accessible. It's scholarly, but not overly scholarly. It's totally accessible from a layman's standpoint, but it has the nuggets that you need in there to do a really good in-depth study on the book of 1st or 2nd Thessalonians. So, Gene, thanks again for spending time with us.
My
really
joy.
Appreciate it. It was a blessing.
God bless you guys and all of you.
You too, brother. All right, everyone.
Take care.
See you guys next week as we start in, we're starting into the pastorals, right? Look at us flying through the New Testament.
We're brave.
Exactly. Let's see what we learn there. All right, everyone. See you guys next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you dug it, please subscribe and share it with others. Check us out at Determinetruth.com to see more of what we do and maybe even consider supporting us. See you next time.
Faith is an ocean you can walk on.